everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, and thank you for joining us for our Budgeting and Forecasting Best Practices webinar. Before we get started, I just want to introduce myself. My name is Stephanie Tortorici, and I'm one of the account managers here at TGO Consulting. With us today, we have Alan Whitehouse from TrueSky, and he'll be running us through our webinar today. Quick agenda for our presentation. We'll start with an overview of TGO, followed by an overview of TrueSky. We'll then have a quick survey, followed by our presentation and questions and answers. Just one housekeeping item. All your phones are on mute so that we can reduce any background noise. If you have any questions during the session, please feel free to type it into the GoToWebinar interface and we'll read them out at the end of the presentation. We'll also have a survey that pops up when you leave the presentation, and we'd really appreciate it if you take the time to fill it in to help us improve all our future offerings. Just a quick introduction to TGO Consulting for those of you who don't know. We're financial systems specialists focused on the office of the CFO. We guarantee the success of our projects at a fixed fee. We're always looking for ways to educate our clients and prospects with new solutions to help enhance their dynamic solutions. You'll also see on the screen a few of the different things that we can help with, and we'd be happy to get in touch if you have any questions or need any of our support. I'm going to pass the presentation over to Alan now, who will start with a little intro to TrueSky and then get started on our best practices webinar.
Thank you, Stephanie. So I'm going to start with just give you a little bit of overview of the company that I'm with and talk a little bit about TrueSky. So TrueSky, we simplify the budgeting and forecasting process for companies using Excel. We actually have an application that's geared all around towards budgeting and forecasting. And that's not going to be the presentation today. This is just a generic best practices on budgeting and forecasting, so it's not based on an application. But again, if you decide at some point in your life you need an application to do your budgeting and forecasting to help you out, please consider TrueSky, because our application supports doing any kind of budgeting, forecasting, and planning that you would like to, reporting, analytics, as well as dashboarding. All right, so as we're going to get going through here, I'm going to set the stage, make sure we're all on the same page. But actually, really quickly before I do that, one thing, I'm going to start a quick little poll here, and it really just helps me set the tone for where we're at right now and who is actually online and what you're using. So up should be popping a quick thing that talks about really asking you if you're using Excel or not for your budgeting and forecasting. And I just kind of want to get a handle on that. I've got a majority of you voted. I'm just going to leave it open for a few more minutes or a few more seconds here just to kind of see where we're at here. All right, cool. So this is actually, well, we got 100% of you voted. Great, thank you very much for that. And actually 100% of you are using Excel as your tool for budgeting and forecasting at this time. Thank you for taking the time to do that, because that does help me plan on how to present a couple things here. So hang on half a second. And all right, so let's set the stage here so we make sure that we're all on the same page as we're going forward. So first thing is, throughout this presentation, I'm going to use the term budget. I might sometimes use the word plan. I might use the word forecast. In effect, I'm talking about the same thing. You know, it's data capture, and really the only difference between a budget versus a forecast, some people think of it, one being expenses, the other being revenue, but again, the process is usually the same. Some people think forecasts might be at a different level of granularity or whatever, but all the stuff I'm going to talk about is going to apply to the same thing. If I use the word template, it usually means I'm going to be talking about some form of data input form, okay? In Excel, that would be the kind of sheet that you set up where people are putting their numbers in. If I use the term a contributor to the budgeting process, that tends to be someone that is doing data input, okay? That's what I mean by I use the term contributor. If I use the term reviewer, that's synonymous with someone that's approving. So they're taking those, looking at the numbers that the contributors are giving them, and they're giving them that thumbs up or thumbs down. Excel is going to be the focus of this. So again, you're all using Excel, which is great. So everything I'm going to do here is more or less geared around using Excel as your primary tool. And the most important thing you need to remember about this presentation is that your presenter, myself, is unbelievably smart, handsome, and witty. So as long as we believe that, we're all on the same page here. All right. So let's talk a little bit about why they're doing budgeting and why do we budget, right? So what are some of the reasons that we budget? Well, first and foremost is because we have to, right? So, and that seems like a little bit of a flippant answer, but it's really not. If you ask a lot of your frontline people that are working on the budget, you ask them, why are we doing the budget? Their answer will be because we have to, and from their point of view, that's probably true. But from an organizational point of view, you've got a lot of reasons that you have to budget, right? You have mandates in place placed on you by your board of directors to provide a budget. You have maybe covenants with your financial institution about where you're going to be. So in many ways, that answer, because we have to, in some aspects, budgeting is forced upon you. You do it for some financial predictability, right? You're trying to get a gauge for where you are going to be in the future. You're also doing it in many ways. Let's say you're an organization that relies heavily on commodities as part of your product offering. Well, if you know what your budget's the future, you have some ideas of maybe you should go and be buying futures options or something for some of those items that you use. You budget to understand the business drivers, right? So what are our quantities? How many people do we need to have? And at the end of the day, you budget to manage people's performance, holding them accountable to certain goals. Well, what are some of the elements of a budget that go into it? I'm going to break these into some main categories that I think. Well, first of all, you have the people element of a budget. And that really all revolves around, you know, and what makes or break a budget and the people thing is their involvement. How involved are they? How accountable are they to that budget and the numbers they put in, and how much time do they give in? And again, as I go through this, I'm going to talk about some of these. When we talk about the data element of a budget, it tends to be what level of details, what are the drivers, what kind of external information, what kind of timeliness. I'm going to go through all of these in just a second. And then we have the process aspect of an element of a budget, which consists of accessibility, security, visibility, confidence, duration, and frequency. So when we talk about the people aspect of the thing that you have to take into account when you're building your budgeting process is what is the people's level of involvement going to be? And involvement means both physical involvement as well as mental involvement. So physical involvement, how much time do they have to work on the budget? You have to give that into account when you're giving and thinking about all of your timelines and everything else for the budget. If they don't have enough physical time to get it done along with all their other tasks, well, then that's going to affect your budget. You also need to talk about mental involvement. You know, how much mind space do they have to work on the budget? That is something that people don't take into account when you're thinking about your budget cycle, is the mental aspect of people getting into it. Other aspect of the people aspect of the budget that you have to think about, the accountability, right? If people can put in whatever number they want and they're never held accountable to those budget numbers compared to your actuals, then there's never any incentive to actually spend the time and do it right. Again, if I don't, if I can put in if it makes no difference to you if I put in $1 or $100 million at the end of the day and there's no ramifications to that, then why should I spend any time trying to get it right? And then the other thing that tends to get overlooked from the people aspect is giving people enough time to get through the budget. Again, remember when you roll out budgets to individuals, usually they have to continue to do all of their normal day-to-day business to get it through. And so you have to think about that when you're doing the budget cycle, and you have to think about how do we get people more time? How do we allocate tasks out? The data element, again, is just as critical to the element budget. And part of that I like to talk about is what are your details? And a lot of the stuff I'm going to go in as we go in more in this process into each of these little areas, by the way. And before I forget, we have a white paper that is associated with this presentation. And at the end of this, so don't think you have to freak out and worry about taking notes and everything else. Everything I'm talking about is inside a white paper that we have. At the end of this presentation, when the survey pops up, if you put in a request for a copy of this white paper or go out to our website, you'll be able to get a copy of it. So just keep that in mind. So thinking about the data element of the aspect, a big thing that you have to talk about is the level of detail that you capture. Many people think we got to have, and detail is a double-edged sword. Sometimes you can be capturing too much detail, and in other areas you might not be capturing enough detail, and we're going to talk about this as we go through. Drivers. Are you capturing just numbers, or are you actually capturing things like units and unit prices and quantities? And I'm going to talk about why that's important as we go forward. External information. Are you taking into account enough external aspects of what's going on around in your neighborhood, in your industry, in your government or whatever to do your budgeting cycle? And how accurate and how timely is the data that you have that you're working with? And again, we'll go through all of these things. Then we get into the process. You know, how accessible is your data, is the system that you're using to capture budgets, as well, hand in hand, is how secure is your system. Everyone seems to worry about security, and in fact, in many situations, I see clients worrying a little too much about security to the point that it's actually hamstringing their people to getting in good quality budget numbers, and there is a balancing act, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Visibility. Do your people have any insight into how the budget is shaping up as it's being done? How confident are you in the budget numbers at the end of the day? Have people done a good enough job to give you accurate numbers? How long does the budgeting cycle take? Hopefully through this presentation, I'm going to give you some tips and tricks that will help speed that up. And how often are you doing budgeting? And this is a big one that you need to think about, is that as an organization, if you're just doing a once a year budget and that's it, that's not going to cut it going forward. The world today runs on internet time, where information is instantly disseminated globally. And if you're only doing a once a year budget, you are going to rapidly get left behind. And you need to really think about moving at a minimum to quarterly reforecasting, or ideally to monthly reforecasting of your budget numbers. Now, the problem is, in any of these areas, if you have a breakdown in any of these areas, whether it be the people's involvement, their accountability, or how much time they have available to them, any of the problems with the data or the process, at the end of the day, it's going to dramatically affect the accuracy of the numbers that you've put together. Again, and I'm going to try to hopefully help you with that as we go through this presentation. So let's talk about the typical versus the ideal budget cycle when using Excel. Well, typical budget cycle, if you're using Excel for the once a year budget, is probably something like you see right now up on the screen, where it probably starts about 4 months out if you have any length of time, any complexity and users in your thing. And how you allocate your time is based on those chevrons up above, where you're spending a whole lot of time creating a whole bunch of different Excel workbooks. And why is that? Well, Excel's not multi-user by design. And the only way you can get multiple users into it, and well as dealing with security, because Excel doesn't have a security model, is creating multiple different workbooks. One workbook for each location, for each user, for each department, each division, each business unit, each product line, whatever the case may be. You spend a huge amount of time creating those, scraping data out of your ERP to populate the actuals and last year's budgets, and testing all the linkages and all those formulas and everything else. Then it takes quite a bit of time to get your people to input. And why is that? Well, a lot of that is because many of the input sheets that you design, and because it's the accounting and finance group that designs them, they are designed with an accounting and finance mentality in mind. However, if you're any kind of distributed organization and you've started adding people that are branch managers, sales managers, department managers, product managers, whatever have you, they're not accountants. Yet all the forms and layouts and designs are all accounting based, and it actually is not geared towards how they need to work. And I'm going to give you some ideas on how to handle that going forward in order to get through it. Then you have that big purple thing, which is probably the most painful process you deal with in Excel, which is using that painful merge. And that's where you're dealing with all those broken formulas, and because people have added rows, deleted columns, and everything else. Well, what you should be striving for is probably something like this down below, which is where you have budget input sheets that are reusable from budget cycle to budget cycle, that you have layouts that are conducive to getting people in and out of the data entry as quick as possible. that you minimize to eliminate that whole merge pane, and that you gain more time to do analysis and strategy on your numbers before you go to present it to your board of directors, your management, your ownership, or whatever. So everything I'm going to go through this presentation is going to be geared around that lower section and how we get you from the upper section to the lower section. So let's first talk about the create process. And really the goal here is that the better you are at capturing the data, ultimately the better your end results are going to be. So how do we help facilitate that during the creating of these templates and everything else? Well, first of all, let's remember the golden rule. So when you're thinking about creating all of your different input sheets and all your layouts and your design, this is the one golden rule that I have for budgeting and forecasting in Excel. And if you can do nothing else but take this one away, you'll be ahead of the game. And this is that golden rule. And at the end of the day, no one likes budgeting. Okay? There are people that do budgeting for a living, budgeting forecast. So there's a small number, and I say this a little facetiously, but for the most part, if you were to poll your people and ask them, do you like doing the budgeting cycle every year? You're not going to get any hands that get raised up. And out of 100 people, you'll get 99 that say they don't like it. So again, keeping this in mind and building all of your processes, all of your input sheets, everything you do around this in mind, you'll be way ahead of the game. All right. Well, what's the next thing that you have to think about when you're creating things is that you have to make sure that you spend a little time to give people guidance. Remember, they're not doing budgeting every day. They're doing it once a year. Maybe they're doing it once a year with a couple of reforecasts. So every 4 months, they're in there working on the budgets. So don't forget to spend a little bit of time giving them some guidance about what increases are mandatory, what decreases are required, and so forth, and how they should go through the process. And how would I suggest doing that in Excel? It's simple. Add a worksheet at the start of the workbook that you send out that gives them instructions. Tell them about what you're expecting out of them. When is it due? Try to get it out of email. I mean, because we get hundreds of emails every day. Some of them are work, a bulk of them are spam. I've won the UK European lottery, I think 6 times this month already, right? So put it all in one place so they remember what's going on. Again, that's going to help get them in and out and help keep it fresh in their mind what they're supposed to do. All right, next, kind of the golden rule, keep it simple. This is the other thing. I'm going to give you an example of a real life client example that I worked with. And this is an example that you're seeing up on screen of one of their input sheets, okay? At first blush, this doesn't look too bad, right? I'm looking at I got a couple of those. I got some accounts coming down the side. I got some time periods going across the top. I've got some cells I've got to do entry into. Well, it wasn't until you zoom out to 12% that you could actually see, and this is honest to God, their complete budget input template. That's what they were having users enter things into. Now, I would put to you that this is probably doubling, or at a minimum, it's doubling, more likely quadrupling the amount of time it takes for your people to get in and out of this budget process. Because by the time you scroll to the bottom, you've completely forgotten anything you've put up top. By the time you scroll to the right, you've completely forgot everything that you've put in it as well. It's so much back and forth, so much lost productivity that you're dramatically increasing the amount of time that people spend just trying to get numbers into the system. Well, what should an input sheet look like in real life? Well, here's an example of something that I think is very, very well. Streamline it for your people. Give them the minimal amount that they have to work with to get through the process. People tend to think, well, I got to give 5 years of actuals and 3 years of prior budgets to get through the numbers. The reality is your people don't look at those. Odds are they only look at current actuals and last year's budget, and that's what they base their current budget on. I know you'd like to think they're putting more work into it, but studies show in the reality they're not. Okay, so here's an example, and I'm going to give you some kind of best practices here that I like to recommend to people. So first and foremost, agree on a color schema that is consistent and everyone understands. So in my example here, all the gray, blue, gray areas of things, those are read-only cells. Those are actuals or variance numbers that they can't change, they should be entering in. It's only the yellow cells that they should be entering in. We like to use a lot of things and limit the amount of times that they're seeing. So we're putting in, here's January, February, March, but we're also using things like the Excel groupings up top here to expand and contract so they can get their heads around the amount of data that they're working with at any one given time. In addition, try to create all of your input sheets such that they're only one screen wide. Such, if you think about how computers work today, again, we've got most people are going rectangular on their screens, right? But if you're having to scroll up and down, almost everybody's mouse has a little scroll wheel. So I can move up and down quickly without having to take my hands off the mouse, my hands off the keyboard. If I have to start going left and right, now I've got to move my stuff down. I got to take my hand, I got to move the little scroll bar to go right and left, and I've forgotten what's on the other side. So whenever possible, build them to be one screen wide. But again, if you have to go up and down, at least make sure they're only one screen wide. This is going to help get people in and out quite a bit quicker of what you're doing. Also, make sure up top, right, what am I working on? Don't hide it. You know what? I'm doing budgeting here for the admin department for my Toronto location. I'm supposed to be budgeting in Canadian dollars, and this is version 1 of the budget, and this is the process that I'm budgeting for, office expenses, right? There's no debate. There's no, what is this information? It's all very, very clear for me right now, okay? Next, make sure you tailor the templates for the budgeting process in play. One size does not fit all, certainly when it comes for users doing data input. So let me give you an example here. This is something that is very much what you would see if you were asking an individual to budget travel expenses, okay? Now, this template up on the screen that you see is very much accounting focused, right? Odds are airfare ties back to a GL natural account. Hotels and lodging ties to a natural account. Meals and entertainment is a natural account. Rental cars, travel expenses, all tied in natural accounts. So again, this is very much an accountant-based layout. Problem is, I give this to someone who is a sales manager or a traveling salesperson who goes on client visits. And you ask me to budget for airfare, hotels, and lodging. This is not intuitive for me. What am I doing? I am creating my own spreadsheet on my desktop. And I'm probably going to list, these are all the customers I'm going to visit and when I'm going to visit them. And with those trips, I know for this customer, I'm going to have airfare and I'm going to need a hotel. I know for this customer, they're close enough, I'm going to drive, so I'm going to have mileage, but I'm going to need to take them out to dinner when I'm out there, right? So they're creating their own spreadsheets with all their information, and they're summing those up and copying and pasting their numbers into your final thing. And there's two problems with that. Again, one, you're increasing the amount of time and effort it takes to get through the budget, but all that great backup detail is lost. Well, if you do some smart Excel design with some smart linkages that I'll show you later, maybe a better layout would be something like you got up here if you're doing travel expenses for all your department managers, where you've made their individual trip, like I'm taking a trip to Vegas or to Macau or Monaco, the primary focus, and with those, these are the cost categories. And yet you can still map back all of my airfare costs, all of my hotel costs back to your main financial kind of based formula. This is going to get your people in and out of the process quicker, and you're going to get more detail that you're going to, at the end of the day, 6 months from now when you're doing the budget to actual type reporting. Next, make sure you connect to your data. Don't do copy and paste. So a lot of times what I'll see people doing, and this is part of why you have to keep reinventing the wheel each and every budget cycle, is to get something like your actuals in. You're going to, today odds are you're going to run some kind of report out of your accounting system, right? And that's going to dump into maybe a PDF, maybe a Word document, maybe some other kind of reporting format. You're going to copy and paste that into your template. You're probably going to do some manual data manipulation. And the problem with that is you have to redo that each and every time you do the budget, okay? And that's just a huge waste of time. It doesn't make everything repeatable. Well, in Excel, again, there are some great capabilities to actually tie into data directly, whether it be from your ERP's data size or from websites. Again, now, I'm going to walk through one example of doing this, but this has gone into more detail in our white paper of how you connect to the data. Now, it is a little technical. This is one of those areas where you might need a little help from your IT group, but if you invest the time and effort here, even if you have to bring in an outside consultant and spend a few dollars on it, this will have a huge ROI for you. But I'm going to show you an example we had to do for a client one time where knowing exchange rates on a real-time basis was very important for them for their budgeting process. So they used to go out and type all these up and type them in. It was a lot of rework and rework. Well, in Excel, as an example, they give you the ability not only to tie to SQL Server, to tie to Access databases, whatever, but you can pull data from a website. So this is an example of how we had to go out and grab exchange rates, and here we're going to a bank commercial website, but it pulls in this data. And ultimately, we were able to create linkages to the external data that you found in these websites that refreshed every time people opened up their budget input templates. So again, you can do those same kind of things, pulling actuals in from your accounting system. And again, those direct linkages automatically refresh. It will save you a huge amount of time. All right, a couple other things, next thing to do. Make sure you spend some time to put some validation rules up front. So a lot of times when people are going to go and create their budget input sheets and you try to roll them up, you track down a lot of formula errors that, you know, pound REF, pound value kind of errors. Well, that's because people put in things like text where you were expecting $1 or what have you. Well, you can create input rules using the data validation features that are built into Excel. Here's an example here where you can do certain things where you want to set up, you know what, we're only going to allow whole numbers in these cells. We're not going to allow text. We're not going to allow anything with a decimal or whatever. And here the example is if you create these rules and they try to put in things that are not whole numbers, then they're going to get an error amount, and you're going to stop that at the time they're doing data entry. So you're able to put in a lot of these validation rules up front in your Excel templates. Again, people tend not to know these kind of functionalities exist. And again, you're doing better at your data capture up front, and it's also going to make that merge process go that much easier at the end of the day because there's going to be less errors you're trying to track down. All right, next one, when you're thinking about creating your templates, is think about your naming conventions, all right? So let's talk about some things that I tend to see in real life. So if you look about naming conventions for your Excel workbooks, things that are not so good would be what you would see up above things. So that first one, SALS budget V1, that's probably the sales budget version 1, but maybe that's the budget for salsa in your organization. The next one, which is that fine budget 2015 BK. Now, is that the finance budget, or was that the final budget for 2015? And was the BK, was that a backup? I don't know. The next one, probably operations budget. That's my guess for the year 15-16. Down below are some better examples. Again, it doesn't matter what you do. Just make sure you got some really good structured naming conventions for your worksheet. So if you're going to float around 50 or 100 different workbooks, invest in making sure you know what they are, and that you really stress under pain of death to your individuals that they don't rename those workbooks. So down below, kind of a schema I like when you're talking about what if you had a location and department, like here's the location name, Toronto, finance, it's the finance department. This is the office expense budget for 2015. The next one is the Seattle for the finance department office expense budget. Then you have the production materials expense budget down below. Again, it doesn't matter what you do it, just invest in some really good high quality naming conventions. All right, so let's talk about what you can do on the input side to get the best data out of the people who are working on the budget. Okay, first and foremost, beat out of your people the divide by 12 mentality. And that's where, even though you're asking them to forecast for the next 12 months, they take a number that they think they're going to hit and divide it by 12. And I'm going to tell you why that is a really bad way to go. And I'm going to call it the seasonal dilemma. All right. In this example here, you're a ski resort. All right. The blue are my actuals. The red is my budget. Okay. And I am forecasting, this could be materials cost, this could be salaries, doesn't matter what I'm forecasting here, but if I do the divide by 12, and I'm doing basically $1,200, all right, for the year. So if you see the divide by 12, that's where the red gives me for the budget. And that's even from month to month to month. But if you're a ski resort and this is your payroll costs, probably how it's going to flow is what you see above, where you got much higher costs in January and February. Things start to drop in March as the snow melts. They drop really low through the summer months, and they start to pick up in the fall as you're getting the ski resort better to go, or ready to go again for the next budget cycle. Now, why is the divide by 12 a bad way to go here? Well, at the end of the day, yeah, you've budgeted $1,200 for this expense for the whole year, and your actuals are 1,200 and your budget's 1,200. Great, that's fine. But if you're using this to then ultimately feed into something like a cash flow projection, well, guess what? You're now over and under on your expenses, and you've run out of cash in January and February and can't make payroll because of how you were forecasting. So eliminate the divide by 12 mentality with your people. All right, the next one, budget your ultimate business drivers and not dollars. Okay, let Excel do the calculations, and I'm going to show you why that's important. So this is why you want to budget the business drivers. So example one, your people are predicting $5 million in sales for the year. Great. Well, right now, traditionally, you have a $10,000 unit price, which ultimately means you've got 500 units that you're going to build, warehouse, and ship. No big deal, right? However, same prediction. Your people are predicting $5 million in sales. And again, if that's all you're capturing, no big deal. But what you don't know is that the sales group is now thinking, we're going to drop our unit price to $2,500 per unit, which now means you've got 2,000 units to build, warehouse, and ship, which means you've got 4 times the volume. That 4 times the volume has a huge effect on your bottom line. You may have to run another production line to meet the volume. You may have to hire more staff to run those production lines. If you are ordering from overseas and you've got a 3-month time lag because of the slow, shipping from China in the big container ships, well, guess what? You have to plan for that. So if you're only budgeting the dollars and not the unit prices and the quantities, you're going to be left in a bad situation. So, budget things like unit price and quantities, let Excel formulas do the final math, and you will be better off. It's also how you're going to be able to get a better gauge for performance. All right. Make sure you spend some time budgeting the details. Now, this is one of the areas, there's only a couple areas in this presentation I'm going to talk about. We're actually having a dedicated budgeting and forecasting application is going to help you out. And this is one of those areas. So right here, I'm going to use the example of budgeting something like we're doing administrative expenses and you're budgeting conference registrations. Well, in an Excel environment, right, people are just putting in numbers and you don't know how many conferences that people are budgeting for. And you don't know if your people are budgeting for 1 conference or 100 conferences and if they're going a little wild or not. Well, it's really useful to try to budget things like roll-up information, so how many different conferences people are going to. Now, you can do this in Excel and you can do special templates and groupings. This is the kind of thing that is better with an application, but giving you some insight here, it lets you know on those areas why you might be high or low. All right, spend some time capturing the knowledge, not just the numbers, okay? Getting some insight into what your people are thinking is really critical to knowing if their numbers are any way, shape, or form reflect reality. Okay, if last year's sales were $2 million and this year I'm predicting $10 million, and you don't know why that person is getting such a big jump, a 5-fold increase in sales in 1 year is huge, right? You don't know if those numbers are even reasonable, or is this just a typo? So how would you do that in Excel? Spend some time using the right mouse click and adding comments. Now, the one problem with using Excel comments is that as you roll all of these numbers up into your master budget, the comments don't roll up. So one of the ways to get around that, again, is doing something like an application, and this is like our application True Sky, and I'm not really plugging ours heavily here today, but we give you that capability of actually capturing notes, and notes that are tied to the data so they roll up. So when you roll up all your departments, all of your notes roll up. When you roll up all your product lines, all of those notes roll up, and they can be printed out at the end of your budget cycle, so you have some way to look at that. All right, here's the other thing that I want you to consider about to get your numbers from your people quicker, is considering putting in fake deadlines. Now, I know this seems juvenile, but every organization has people that even though you say the budget is due Friday at 3 p.m., they don't get the budget done Friday at 3 p.m., right? It's like 3 or 4 days later before they do it. And they're only thinking about themselves, but this has that ripple effect because then when it goes to the next person for approving those numbers, they're already behind the 8 ball because they didn't get the numbers in time. And then when it comes final thing and you're trying to merge all this together, you're behind the 8 ball because you didn't get the numbers in time. So everybody has these situations, these people that just can't get their stuff done in time. consider giving them fake deadlines. And if, those of you that are on this, this presentation, if you've got kids, how often, think about it in those terms, how often do you tell your kids that you need to leave at 3:45 when in fact to get there on time, when in fact you really don't have to leave until 4 o'clock, but by the time you get their jackets on, their shoes on, and get them away from off the video games or whatever, same kind of thing. And I know it seems a little juvenile, but sometimes you have to keep your people like that if you want to get through the budget in time. Next, if you want really good quality input numbers, think about zero-based budgeting. It's a very important kind of thing. And I'm going to give you, in zero-based budgeting, for those of you that don't know what that means is that you don't provide your people, when they do budgeting this year, last year's budget. And in many cases, you don't even provide them actuals to get started with. And the reason for that is that you are forcing them to, from the ground up, justify their budget each and every year. And by doing zero-based budgeting, it gets you away from what I call budget inflation, where people just simply take last year's budget and bump it up by 5%, or take last year's actuals and bump them up by 5%. So yeah, it's close enough, and I'm just going to bump it up to cover myself. But what happens if you don't do zero-based budgeting is that people tend to just constantly add more and more and more without giving any thought to, do I really need more in these areas, or can I cut, or can I increase here when I should be decreasing, or what have you. Now, the biggest pushback I get on zero-based budgeting is that it's really difficult to do, and my response to that is, yep, it's very difficult. It's incredibly difficult, but it's going to give you the highest quality numbers possible. Now, zero-based budgeting does not have to be an all or nothing kind of situation. In your organization, odds are, think about the 80-20 rule. You've got, 20% of your cost categories probably make up 80% of your costs. So maybe you're only going to pick one or two of your major cost or revenue items that have that material bottom line on your organization, and those you're going to zero-based budget. The rest, things like postage costs, or, how much you're going to spend on office supplies, right? Those, even if you're off by a factor of 5, don't make a big difference. Maybe those you don't zero-base. So it doesn't have to be an all or nothing type of thing. All right. The other big thing that I think doesn't happen a lot in budgeting is collaboration. I think it's critical to get your people collaborating on the budget. And this is collaboration two ways. These are different department heads, different location branch managers, all collaborating, because many times they know things that the other person doesn't know, right? Somebody's heard, guess what? Our big competitor is moving into our neighborhood. Did you realize that? No. Well, that's going to adjust your budget. Did you know that, this new legislation is being tabled by the government, and that's going to affect what we do, right? A lot of times people don't have that information, so getting everyone on the same page is doing that. Also, letting managers look at the numbers while they're being worked on and giving people guidance as they go along, that's critical as well. There's a lot of different ways to do collaboration. There's a lot of tools that are out there. This is one that I tend to recommend. We don't make a dime on this, so it's just a tool that is very good. It's called Yammer. It's a Microsoft tool. There's a lot of other ones out there, but it's kind of like Facebook, but for corporate businesses. Something that you could think about doing. It's a great way to put in discussions and chat about things, making everything in your environment more collaborative. All right. The other thing to think about is, are you budgeting actions versus transactions? Okay, and I'm going to give you an example of what this is all about. Let's talk about actions, right? You plan to exhibit at a trade show in March, and this is getting people thinking about, for those of you accountants, cash base versus accrual is what this is going to come ultimately down to, right? If you plan to exhibit at a trade show in March, odds are you people are going to budget $10,000. Estimated total spend is going to be entered for March. However, on a transaction base, don't forget that you've got to reserve your space for that trade show in January, and that's the $7,000 that you're going to spend. You've got AV fees that you got to spend $2,000 are that due in February, and marketing materials that are due $1,000 in March. Now, the debate is, what dates should you use to budget? I see this an awful lot when people are talking about, why are we over or under budget for a particular month? there is no perfect answer to this on whether you should use kind of the action or the transaction dates here, only to assume that you need to be on the same page in your organization. I would tend to go with the transaction because odds are if you're ever going to show actuals, you want it to align. But at the end of the day, it's what's going to work for your organization. Just make sure everyone's clear and that you're on the same page for how you do it. All right. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the merge concept and how do we help get you all of that data back into one comprehensive budget. And this is probably the biggest pain in the budgeting cycle, right? So let's talk about storage and retrieval concepts here that are going to help get you through this merge process first. So here are some tips on storage, okay? First of all, centralize your storage of all of the Excel workbooks and worksheets, right? Get them off of individual people's desktops and worktops and get them in a shared folder on your servers, okay? Or on whatever document storage tool you use, if you're using something like a SharePoint or whatever else. Next, keep in mind, email should be for email. Email should not be for storage. Don't have your people store critical documents like your budget documents in email. Again, somebody gets hit by a bus, they go out sick. This is very difficult for anyone else to pick up and run with these. We talked about earlier about your naming conventions. Make sure people don't rename items. Ensure that wherever you're storing all these budget dockets, they are being backed up. They are being backed up. They are being backed up. I have had more than one client that has had a critical failure and lost everything because they created some folders out there. They were managing the budget cycle and IT didn't know those folders were now being used on an enterprise basis and they weren't in the backup routine and everything was lost. All right, now let's talk a little bit about that merge process. So make sure you're using formulas to link all of your workbooks and your worksheets, not doing copy paste. Now, one of the things that a lot of people don't realize, and again, I talk about this in the white paper, so this goes into far more detail there, is people are pretty good at knowing that within individual worksheets, you can do linkages and formulas. However, what people tend not to realize is that formulas can also link to workbooks as well. So you can have one master workbook that is your global roll-up of all these individual worksheets that individual users are working on. So you can have that one roll-up consolidated worksheet, and then you can have a worksheet that mirrors every other workbook that you have in the organization. So at any time you can do a roll-up. And you can link it. That's an example of what the formula looks like to tie it to the workbook. But you can link all these workbooks together, and by doing that at the push of a button, because you've linked all these individual workbooks into your master workbook, at one data refresh button, you can consolidate and roll up all of your budget. Now, what is one of the keys to having a successful merge? Well, the biggest one is you need to make sure you protect that workbook and you lock down the cells so that people cannot edit the workbook in ways that you don't like them to do. So earlier on we talked about making sure you do data validation. So now you're making sure that people only put in numbers where you expect numbers. Now what you're doing here is you're actually protecting the worksheet. It's under here under the review tab where you can protect the worksheet. You're going to be able to lock down every other cell, every formula, and take away the ability for people to insert rows, delete columns, and so forth by protecting the workbook. And they're only going to be entering into those 10 or 20 or 100 cells that you allow them to do. Now, the most critical thing that I can tell you about is if you are going to start protecting workbooks and worksheets to prevent people from edit them and change them, is that you need to make sure you write that password down and at least one other person in your organization knows it. Because once you've locked down a workbook with a password, if you forget that password, you are out of luck. If only one person in your organization knows that password and they leave your organization, especially if they're disgruntled, you are out of luck again. So make sure it is known by at least 2 people so you've got it. All right. Next, if you want that merge to go away completely and you want to get rid of that pain, invest in a budgeting and forecasting application because regardless of which one it is, most of them do automatic merging, many of them do real-time merging, and again, as a blatant plug for us, if you are interested in a budgeting application that will get rid of that merge completely, go out to our website, truesky.com, and you can learn a little bit more about our application because we do automatic merging in real time. All right, talk a little bit about the review process here. And this is this is something that people need to think more about, is how they approach the review process. Review is ensuring that your numbers make sense, that people are budgeting the right numbers. Review you should not spend a lot of time or have to spend any time at all during the review process to confirm whether or not your merge worked correctly. You're looking at a review from a business point of view. First, make sure you give yourself enough time. People really underestimate how long it should be taking to review these numbers, dive into them, ask questions about those numbers. And a lot of times you get a cursory, oh yeah, the numbers have only gone up by 2% over last year, it's okay. That's not the way to do review. Other ones, really, you shouldn't be sweating the small stuff. And I'm going to give you an example here. Again, this comes from a real life example that I saw at one time with a company we were working with. If you look at here, this is what people were budgeting and inputting. And if you look at the dollars that we're putting in here, I'm going to go back to those of you that can remember, Sesame Street. One of these things is not like the other. One of these things doesn't belong. Well, let's look at postage, right? You're budgeting salaries of over $1 million a year, rents of $500,000, taxes of $300,000, whatever, right? You look at that budget that's $2 million. You got a $2 million run rate on your budget each month, and then you're asking people to enter and review postage, which is $2,000. Now, I would say that that number has to be, even if that number you're off by a factor of 10, it's not material in that budget. You'd have to be off by a factor of almost 100 before that number becomes material in your budget. So why are you asking people to review it and approve it? Again, you're wasting a lot of people's valuable time for numbers at the end of the day probably don't make material effect on your bottom line. So keep that in mind. Next, you need to decide who owns the numbers, okay? Often in organizations, you will hear, hey, those aren't my numbers, somebody changed those numbers, you can't hold me accountable for those numbers. And why is that? Well, I put numbers in, I email my workbook to somebody else who then has the ability to not just review and do it and give a thumbs up or thumbs down, but can also edit those numbers. The problem is that those changes tend not to get published back to those original frontline people, and now they're being held accountable to stuff that they didn't realize they were being held accountable to. So in my perfect world, people that review numbers, that give the approvals, those second tier people, should only ever give a thumbs up or thumbs down. And if they want changes, they should send it back to those frontline contributors who should then make the changes. That way you ensure everyone's on the same page. However, if you are going to let your reviewers make changes, you need to put a process in place that makes sure they inform the initial people of what changes were made and why they were made, and give them some ability to comment on those changes, just to ensure that everyone is on the same page. All right. Next, make sure you understand the context. All right. You've got to know just not why the numbers are there, but you've got to look at all the comments and the notes and why people were budgeting the way they were. Because if you're just looking at the raw numbers, you're missing a big piece of the puzzle. All right. At the end of the day, if you're doing budgeting collaboratively, if you've put in your validation rules, if you've locked down the workbook, if you've decided who owns the numbers and you've got all the context there, any surprises during the review process, like, well, this was $2 million and now you're coming back with 10, that's a surprise to me. Well, you failed at the process. You haven't thought about all the stuff that we've talked about up to this point. Well, now let's move into that new phase that we're going to gain you time by doing, which is the analysis phase. And this is really turning those raw numbers that you get. Everything you've done at this point is raw numbers. It's not information. This is how you turn those numbers into information that you can use to make informed business decisions. First thing to keep about analysis, this is the whole point of doing your budget. Otherwise, it's just a make work effort. This analysis phase, this is the time to be thinking about strategy and how you're going to move the business, in one direction based on those numbers, and thinking about all your what if kind of things. This is not the time to review and give a thumbs up or thumbs down. This is where you're going to say, hey, if these, you're saying, you know what, these are what the number's going to be. And if this is what our sales numbers are going to be, this is what our costs are going to be, well, this is how we need to change the business in order to move forward, okay? This is not this time to say, oh, I don't like those numbers, go back and change them, all right? Make sure you're analyzing all the content. You're looking at the numbers. You are looking at the notes. Also, you need to be looking at what is going on in the business world around you, and not enough of this happens during the analysis phase. People tend to look at this year's numbers compared to last year's numbers. They're also not spending enough time looking into what new government regulations are coming into play. Are our competitors moving into our neighborhood? Are our unions happy, or whatever the case may be? You need to analyze all of that when you're looking at finalizing your budget. Utilize a lot of the tools that you may already have and not know that are there. There are some great budgeting tools that are out there. In fact, this is a tool that's built into Excel 2013 and beyond, which is called a spreadsheet compare tool that people don't even know that's there. So if you've got a version 1 of your budget and a version 2 of your budget where people have changed different numbers, you can actually use that tool to compare those side by side, and it will immediately highlight any changes between the two, rather than you have to go line by line by line and try to find where your people made changes. So I'm going to open to a final word here, and then you can type in any questions that you have into the chat window, and we can go from there. When you're building your budgets and through this whole process, really you should be aiming for simplicity in the interface of your input sheets. You should try to increase the functionality of your input templates by using some of the processes and tools that we talked about. Don't forget about that data validation. Make sure you capture more detailed data. Make sure you capture knowledge, not just numbers. Integrate with source data and ensure that you've got everybody on the same page. And in return, you're going to receive the following. You're going to get increased control of the budgeting process. You're going to reduce your administration workload. You're going to get faster turnaround time of the budgeting process. You're going to get greater accuracy. You're going to get more useful information, not just numbers. You're going to get strategic answers to your questions. And at the end of the day, you're going to get more time to think. So at this point, I'm going to say thank you for attending. Up on the screen is the information, contact information for TrueSky. So again, or for TGO. So if TGO has people on staff that can help you with some of the stuff that I've talked about, help improve your budgeting and forecasting process, tips and tricks and everything like that. If you're interested in TrueSky, you can visit us at truesky.com, and there's our contact information up on screen. I'm going to thank you for spending the time. Now, at this point, if you have any questions, again, before you drop off, there'll be a survey. If you want a copy of that white paper that goes through this whole presentation, just ask for it and we'll get you sent out a copy. Thank you for taking the time today. I hope you found this informative. And if you have any questions, go ahead and ask them in the window today, in the little chat window in the GoToWebinar interface.